Rabbanit Sarna and Rabbi David Wolkenfeld. Shalom and welcome to the Straw Hat. We are the official podcast of Anshe Shalom B'nai Israel Congregation, an Orthodox synagogue in the beautiful Lakeview neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois. In this week's episode, we're looking towards Parshat Korach, which we'll be reading this Shabbat. And we'll be talking about community in a few different ways. First, we'll be talking about Minyan, or tefilah b'tzibor, and why 10 people might be the way that we define community. We'll have a next segment in which we will discuss who's in and who's out of the community, of the Jewish community, how that was historically defined, and how that might be defined differently today. Lastly, we'll have an interview with the head of our education committee, Binyamin Cohen. This week's Parsha is Parshat Korach, and in Parshat Korach, Korach gathers together a group of people that the Torah refers to as an Edah. So what is an Edah? How many people make up an Edah? Those are some of the questions discussed in the Talmud in Sanhedrin 74b, when they're in the middle of a discussion about Kiddush Hashem, and what does it mean to sanctify God's name specifically in public. In the beginnings of our tefilah, actually this is part of the tefilah that we don't say together as a tzibur in the show, everyone says it quietly as we're getting ready to start. We say a bracha about Kiddush Hashem. There's different variations of the exact language of the bracha, but it's something like we have the opportunity to sanctify God's name berabim, like in public, around many. So the Talmud is interested in how many constitutes many, and the specific kind of halachic question the Talmud there is talking about is there's certain mitzvot they're in a category of yahareg v'al yavor. You should be killed instead of violating them. So one of those, for example, is murder. If someone's holding a gun to your head and says, kill someone else or else I'll kill you, you're supposed to be killed instead of being a person who commits murder. So that's one category. But then if it's in a time of oppression and someone's trying to get you to violate a commandment in public in order to kind of disgrace the name of God, that then becomes a yahareg v'al yavor status. That becomes something which you should, anything, whatever it is, they say, eat a piece of pork. If that were happening in private, you would eat the pork and not give your life to the sanctification of God. But because it's in public, you're supposed to resist. You're supposed to choose martyrdom in that moment. And so the Gemara asks, "V'kama farhasya," how many people makes up a public act? And Rabbi Yaakov says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, "Ein farhasya pachot me'asara b'nei adam." There's no public less than 10 people. And then the Gemara says, hold on, but how do I know? Does it need to be Jews? Do those 10, is it 10 people or is it 10 Jews? And you could really it's a sharp question because for the purposes of the sanctification of the name of God, you might even want to say, oh, it's 10 non-Jews, right? Yeah. It's actually more important. You could really argue it in many directions. And the Gemara goes on to say, right, Tashma, come in here. Tani Rabbi Yanai teaches in the name of Rabbi Chia bar Ava, Atya toch. So we draw a verbal analogy, a gzera shava on the word among. So we have this pasuk about sanctifying God in public, nikdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael, I shall be sanctified among the children of Israel. And with regard to Korach, you have hibadlu mitoch ha'edah hazo. You have separate yourselves from amongst this congregation. So you have toch nigdashti betoch and hibadlu mitoch, right? So this verbal analogy, this word that's used twice, and in the Talmud often we draw these gzera shavas, where if a word is used in one place and a word is used somewhere else, we can kind of take the meaning from one place and transport that meaning into another place where the word is used. And so the Gemara goes on to say, Mala halan asara v'chuluhu Yisrael, afkan asara v'chuluhu Yisrael. So just as there, we numbered 10 and all were Jews, and they've actually now also connected Korach to the spies, and the spies, they're all Jews, and so that's another leap the Gemara here, or tie, less leap than tie, that the Talmud here makes. So it ties Korach to the spies, they're 10, and they're all Jews, and so to here, in sanctification of the name of God, you have now a requirement for 10 that are all Jews.
point of clarification. There were 12 spies. Where do you get 10?
There were only, thank you, good question. There's 12 spies, one from each tribe. There's 10 bad spies. There's 10 spies who kind of come back and give bad report. And then you have Yehoshua and Kalev who come back and give good report.
So the Daira'ah, the evil congregation, could only mean the 10 bad spies.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Right, so when you have an Eidah that has betoch attached to it, that's in Korach, and then you have another Eidah which is by the spies, and so you connect Eidah from the spies, meaning 10, to Eidah in Korach, and then Toch in Korach to Toch in Kiddush Hashem, and you land up with 10 Jews, and that then becomes the source for a minyan. So right, the original question was V'chama far haseo, what constitutes public, and now we have public as being constituted by 10 Jews. And so what's beautiful then is that actually from these two extremely kind of negative stories of the 10 spies and Korach, that gives rise to one of the most positive daily things that our community really has to offer, which is Minyan.
Okay. Say a little more. Before we veer off into the context of Minyan, I want to say, or Minyan in the context of prayer, which does happen hopefully every day, multiple times a day at our shul. Say a little bit more about Minyan in the context of Kiddush Hashem and whether we define Minyan the same way in these two contexts. Because it seems that we don't, right?
Right, so we actually don't. You'll notice that one of the definitional elements of our minyan that has not been raised is any question of gender. Actually, for a minyan for Kiddush Hashem could even be constituted by women. That's kind of historically been understood. And there have been times, this isn't just a theoretical conversation. As in the summer, as we turn towards Tisha B'Av, still in a bunch of weeks, but on Tisha B'Av we read kinot, and those kinot, those elegies, these sad poetry, come from all these terrible times in Jewish history. And in some of those times, you've really seen Jews dying al Kiddush Hashem, giving over their lives in order to sanctify the name of God, and doing that kind of in public in accordance with these exact rules. And so it's not, the Talmud contains, sometimes theoretical ideas or concepts, and this is actually not one of them. And this concept of Kiddush Hashem, we talk about it very colloquially of I wore my kippah to some event, and then I behaved really well, that was a Kiddush Hashem, and that's beautiful, doing the right thing publicly as a Jew, that's certainly a correct usage of Kiddush Hashem. But then there's kind of uppercase Kiddush Hashem, which is this more kind of technical thing of martyrdom, and saying the word of God is worth dying for.
I think they're both technical. I think the Rambam includes them both in the same sections of his Hilchot Yisodei HaTorah. They're both technical halachic obligations to sanctify God's name. One is through the ethical and kind and positive behavior and reputation of somebody who's identified with Torah and with the Jewish people and with God, and the other is giving one's life, if necessary, when pushed to do so under the circumstances that the halacha ordains. So they're both technical. One is maybe a little more dramatic,
right?
Sure. and one is a one time, and one is.
But we don't define I'm going to this conference wearing my kippah. We don't say, well, that only matters if there's 10 people there, but if there's 8, then you don't have to.
That's fair. That's fair. That is true.
That kind of more colloquial Kiddush Hashem applies with fewer specifications.
Agreed. That's probably true. Yeah. So say something about Minyan since you brought it up.
Sure. So Minyan is a Jewish practice that is near and dear to my heart. I've been davening with a Minyan on weekdays regularly for the entirety of my adult life, beginning in day school. And funnily enough, the only year that I did not daven with a minyan regularly was my year in seminary. There was a minyan of men on the kibbutz that Migdal Oz is on, but they davened at the same time as the Daf Yomi Shir, and I went to the Daf Yomi Shir instead. I don't know. I'm not actually sure now that I would make the same decision. Davening with a minyan has become so constitutive of my identity and also my relationship with tefilah. I say memory, a decade or so earlier, I was a student at Yeshivat HaNiftar, and there were some women from Migdal Oz who would walk over to the yeshiva to say shachrit with us. Right. No, people definitely were doing it. Yeah. It's funny to be in a place where there's 100+ women learning Torah all in the same room, and there's no minyan that happens there. That's like a kind of unique experience to being a Jewish woman. Men's yeshivas don't have these problems, obviously.
Correct.
But yeah, so anyways, davening with a minyan has been a very, very important part of my life all through college, and in college especially, but even post-college, of course. It was a way to say, even though my schedule is so dictated by my classes and my extracurriculars and all of this kind of quote-unquote secular stuff, I'm going to imbue my day with holiness by structuring my life around minyan attendance. And really doing that in a way that's inconvenient. Like if I was at a meeting that undergrads meet at like crazy times, you'd have meetings that would end at 12:30 and minyan's going to be at 7. That doesn't leave a lot of sleeping time, and it involves a good amount of kind of sacrifice in order to make that happen. But to me, that became just really supremely important. That amongst all the busyness of life, that like Judaism makes not just don't do this, yes, do this, don't do the other. It makes a time demand on your life. When time is in some ways one of the most important and most constrained things that we have, to say, actually, I'm gonna separate out this like relatively large, right? If I decided to daven on my own, that would take maybe maximum 15 minutes. If I were better at davening by myself, maybe it would take longer. That's kind of how long it takes. But to daven with a minyan, on Mondays and Thursdays, that could be a good 45 minutes.
Yeah, I want to like to dive into that point. I think for there are some people who pray much more effectively when they're not praying in a congregation, because they go as slow as they want. They say every word, they meditate on every word, and they can spend a good amount of time without having to accommodate anyone else's schedule, and they really pray better. For myself, I also I think when I pray by myself, I find myself rushing. I don't have any other people to help pace myself, and it's too easy for my mind to be. I guess the reason if I'm davening at home is because by myself, I'm doing it typically at home, and so easy to be distracted by
there's dishes over there.
dishes, or a book, or whatever, a magazine, and things like that sort. So I just from
also to push off starting davening until I don't have that much time left.
Oh, that's right. Right. How early are you going to wake up to daven by yourself in your living room right before the meeting begins, right before you have to leave the house? Right. So that's a challenge I have, and that's another reason I think an advantage of joining together with a minyan. I do want to push back a little bit and reinforce our shul branding, which we're trying to pivot away from speaking about prayer with a minyan, which is the 10 men, and speak about tefilah b'tzibur, praying with a congregation. I think we see this. The overemphasis on a minyan, I think, can hurt us in at least two ways. One is women who aren't constituting that minyan nevertheless can fulfill the mitzvah of tefilah b'tzibur. A woman who says the Amidah in the presence of a minyan, that's the same mitzvah as the men there are doing. It's tefilah b'tzibur, reciting the Amidah together at the same time as that minyan, even if she isn't one of the 10 men of the minyan. And the same is also true for the 11th man, or the 12th man, or the 15th man, or the 100th man, right, who is not doing anything to make that minyan. And we sometimes find that challenge when we're convening a minyan, that like everyone wants to be the 10th man, like that's,
and no one wants to be the 11th.
No one wants to, right. No,
I always want to be the 11th.
Yes, you want to be the 11th person to walk into the room. Yeah, I understand. Right, but it's like it's very hard to get right. So, but in fact, the 11th man and the first and second and fifth woman and the 100th man who walks into shul and all say the Amidah at the same time, they're actually all doing the exact same mitzvah, which is tefilah b'tzibur, this enhanced form of prayer, which is when it's done in the company of a minyan. I think that's sort of a helpful way to pivot away from the dichotomy of like the clear, minyan, no minyan, are there 10 men, are there not? So
sure, but I do want to say that I think Judaism has a sense that something happens when there's a minyan present, or when the tzibur comes to pray together in a way that fulfills this, what is farhesia, like what is public. When that public has shown up to daven, it's not like, okay, now like we can say Kaddish. That's actually not like the thing. And that because there's also a halacha that if you can't make it, like if you're stuck at home because let's say you have a child there or something, you should daven at the same time as the minyan is davening. And it's because there's something like moving in the community. Yeah. There's something that's kind of ontologically different maybe about and something probably going on with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, you could even say, when there's a community of people who have gathered to pray together.
Yeah, there's some interesting halakha. You find some halachic ramifications of that. There are two examples that come to mind. One is a woman who's doing a vedika as part of her observance of Hilchot Nida. Mm-hmm. She has to during the day, and if the congregation in her town has said Baruch Hu, right? Then it's too late, okay?
I always thought someone should like clap and be like, if you haven't done your hefsek Torah yet, now's the time.
Right, yes. That would be a little awkward, but we could do that.
It would be a way to kind of like bring the practice of Hilchot Nida like back into the public sphere.
Yes.
Because once upon a time, women were walking around fully in white clothes during their Shiva Nikiyim. Now we wear white underwear instead, and it's not so obvious. But once upon a time, it was obvious who was keeping Nida, who wasn't.
At the time of the Beit HaMikdash, everyone had to know everything about everyone's status because you were eating truma and kachim, and you had to, don't sit on that chair, dad, whatever, like all sorts of. But there's and again, to circle back, the power of the Baruch Hu, right? Even someone not in shul, right? Like for her community, like now is night. The day is over because your shul has started Maariv, even though it's still.
And there's a challenging piece to that, right? In the summer when we daven, when we bring in Shabbos early as a community, so like Meikar Din. Unless we do all the things that we do in terms of messaging around that, Shabbat for the whole of Lakeview should start at that time.
Correct. So that's the other, right. The other ramification would be Shabbat begins when your community begins Shabbat, even if you're not in shul. I think here in Chicago, like there are other synagogues in the city of Chicago. I think we're all one community, at least when it comes to this. And so I don't think any individuals like Shabbat start time is determined by when we say Kabbalat Shabbat here at Anshe Shalom. Right. But it's absolutely true. If you have a community with just one shul, when that shul begins Shabbat, if it's an hour early or 30 minutes early, like everyone has to stop doing work at that time, whether or not they make it to shul. And that's again the power that I think that same kind of like religious power of the community in prayer, even for those who are not in the synagogue.
Yeah, totally. And one piece of that is that, or like kind of how that works is that we get to decide, is it night now or not? Yeah, which is crazy, right? Yeah. Like it seems like we know when sunset is. I can tell you to the 10th of a second when sunset is. And yet that's not really what matters. What really matters is our community has come together and we're deciding now is when we're going to say Maariv, and so night has started or Shabbat has started or whatever it is. Like the Minyan has the ability to affect change, not just in the hearts and souls of those who come, but really kind of in the world. And that's the power of the kind of the Jewish public, which we learn out in part from this week's Parshat Korach.
So having spoken a little bit about the religious power of prayer in a community, I thought it would be worth kind of reviewing some of the more recent halachic discussions about who gets included in community and for what purposes. Classically, this was pretty obvious in the medieval period as the Rishonim, as the great medieval scholars are working through the Talmudic precedent and coming up with their formulations of Jewish law. A core definition of who is a Jew is somebody who observes Shabbat. And at least publicly, right? And when people, obviously, there was a lot of diversions from Jewish observance, even in the Middle Ages, in private, but it was impossible to defy such a strong communal norm like Shabbat observance in public and remain part of the Jewish community. And you had to remain part of a community. If you weren't a Jew, you were a Christian or a Muslim, right? You couldn't...
Citizenship was tied up in that, or lack thereof for Jews.
Exactly, right? And that's sort of what's interesting. Historians speak about Spinoza as like the first modern European in the history of the world, because he was excommunicated from the Jewish community and he never became a Christian, and that was like really impossible in the period before him. So Shabbat observance is the definition of somebody who is Jewish for purposes of ritual participation. Does a man count in the Minyan? If your store is open on Shabbat, you're not going to count in the Minyan in the Middle Ages because you would have already become a Christian, right? You wouldn't have, or a Muslim, okay? In the 19th century, this breaks down, and there are many people who are really loyal Jews in their own minds, but are not observant of a sort of in what we would call like an Orthodox like lifestyle. They're not halakhically observant in a comprehensive way, but they certainly aren't Christian, and they even feel a great deal of loyalty as Jews. The Orach Laner is a sefer that is, I think the first sefer should discuss this in a real worked through way. Orach Laner is written by Yaakov Ettlinger, who, among other things, was the first Orthodox rabbi to get a college degree, and he writes in the 1860s that Poshei Yisrael, these sinners, Bizmanenu, our like contemporary sinners, I don't really know what to do with them because they come to shul and they daven and they say Kiddush and they go off and they go to work and they like open their shops. And that I don't understand that because
doesn't fit into any category.
Doesn't fit into the category. Yeah, and he goes on to say the reason why Shabbat observance was definitional of Jewish identity in the pre-modern period was because if you observe Shabbat, you're acknowledging that God created the universe. And if you don't observe Shabbat, you're denying God's creation of the universe, which means really denying the core tenets of Judaism, and that's why you would lose your Jewish status. But this person, he says Kiddush, he's acknowledging God as the creator, he's acknowledging God took us out of Egypt, he's going to shul, he's participating in Jewish ritual. So clearly this person's Shabbat observance isn't quite communicating that same heretical message that it once did, and so maybe that status should be reevaluated in light of these new circumstances. And so he sort of lays down that position in a theoretical way in the 1860s. In the 20th century, David Zvi Hoffman, who was a great posek in Germany, takes this argument to the next level by pointing out that in halachic literature, in the Talmudic literature, the distinction between public and private Shabbat desecration, which doesn't have anything to do with the laws of Shabbat. Hilchot Shabbat, this doesn't matter if you do it public or private, you write, you cook. It's all forbidden with the same punishment, whether it's in private or public. And yet, one's Jewish status seems to depend on public violation of Shabbat. And what could that mean? So David Zvi Hoffman presents the theory that, it must be that somebody who violates Shabbat in public is really making a statement of, I reject the norms and values and rules of this community. This is not my community anymore. I'm cutting my ties with the Jews and Jewish community by keeping my shop open on Shabbat. Jews don't do that. And that happens as well in Berlin in the 20th century. It's actually us Orthodox Jews. We're the strange ones. We're the minority, and it's those who do keep their stores open on Shabbat and go to school and go to work on Shabbat. They're the ones who are actually engaging in conventional Jewish behavior. We're the strange ones, and so somebody who violates Shabbat, that really can't be considered as that same statement of I reject all my Jewish allegiances, because actually that person is acting in a very Jewish way, and we observant Jews are actually this small minority who are preserving a more ancient understanding of what being Jewish requires. Another stage in this, it was offered in Rabbi Moshe Feinstein in another generation later, 2 generations later in the United States, where pointing to the origin, the Talmudic origin of the idea of Minyan in the 10 wicked spies, said, look, the original Minyan was not a group of righteous people, it was a group of wicked people, and maybe we can be a little bit more accommodating as well of people who are not necessarily religious role models, but for whatever reason, here they are in shul right now, and so they should be included certainly for Minyan purposes and maybe in other ways as well. It still remains, an open question for each community to work through what type of ritual roles should be open to what types of people. All of us have ways in which we don't live up to an ideal of what the Torah asks of us, and I think the question is what type of deviations from the ideal are so significant that a person, let's say their Jewish status is going to be protected, but can they represent the community by leading tefillot or by saying a bracha in a certain way, getting an aliyah, which is not about being Jewish only, it's about representing the entire congregation and being able to be a role model. I think different communities have different conceptions over what exactly that means. I use when I teach this material, I after going through Aruch LaNer and David Zvi Hoffman and Rav Moshe Feinstein, I then share the mission statements of 2 modern Orthodox synagogues from the East Coast, which at the time when I first put together this material, about 10 years ago or so, had nearly identical, modern Orthodox liberal religious practices. And yet one synagogue's mission statement was, I think, several pages of multiple paragraphs, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for, one group to define itself as a shul and, identify its particular values that set it apart from the other shuls in the community. It was a modern Orthodox shul for modern Orthodox Jews with a real clear sense of mission and purpose and identity. And the other shul, I think its mission statement was 1 or 2 sentences, and it says, we're an Orthodox shul serving the entire Jewish people, in which Orthodox practice governed how decisions were made at the ritual level of the shul, but they saw their constituency as much broader. And I think if you define yourself as a shul with a broad constituency, then I think that opens you to maybe even the responsibility to include more people in, not just in as like participants in tefilah, but even as leaders in tefilah, to say, no, like the shul's actually here for you, and we'd love for you to observe Shabbat more conscientiously, but we're going to offer you the opportunity to say an aliyah, because you can represent our community, because our community is comprised of people who observe in very different ways. And I think that,
my chavrusa, Dina Brower, says, there's two ways to think about observance. Everyone's on a journey, but is that journey a line or a circle? So if it's a line, then it's right. The first step is say brachot. The second step is this. The third step is tefilah. And the fourth step is this. And you have to go in order, kind of. Whereas if it's a circle, then it's which mitzvot speak to you the most, and right, is public kriyat Torah a mitzvah that's really important to you? Then maybe you should do that, and it'll lead you on a path to learning about other mitzvot that will then find you important to you. And that path is not really the same as anyone else. That direction around the circle is not the same as anyone else's.
That's very nice. So someone could be a role model for this particular mitzvah, and therefore represent the congregation in that particular mitzvah, even if in other ways they may not yet be a great role model for.
Right, because also I think using Shabbat as your barometer in our day and age is complicated, right? There's loads of people who keep Shabbat who don't keep Choshen Meshpat, and their business dealings are unethical, or they don't pay their taxes, or whatever it is, right? And so to say, we're going to determine it by Shabbat, well,
it's arbitrary. It seems arbitrary.
It doesn't effectively stand in for observance of all mitzvot.
Right, as a synecdoche, whatever.
I think that's what it is. Yeah, something that represents everything. Synecdoche. Yeah.
Yeah. It's also right. That's also the city near Buffalo. But someone said everyone in our shul walks on Shabbat. Some people walk from their apartments. Some people walk from their cars.
Yeah.
That's a different idea.
The question is, the people who walk from their cars, but like they're role models in some other area of halakha that everyone else could aspire to.
Yeah. I don't want to give up like high expectations and high hopes for people to grow, and which is I think a risk of going down that path maybe too far. And I also think it's valuable to just measure the costs and benefits of each type of shul. I think a shul where everyone is there's all in on this kind of very elite level of form of observance and ideology. There's something that can be very powerful for people who are there already and already have that commitment. They can really reinforce each other and encourage each other in a very powerful way, in a way that could be harder in a more open and diverse congregation. I think
it's a community that's much harder to join if you're not there already.
Exactly.
There's no ramp up into it.
Exactly. Sure, like ours, I've seen people really change their lives in really inspiring ways, and people grow in really, really inspiring ways. I think precisely because the entry was so easy, and nothing was really asked of them at the door. And then once involved in the community, they were exposed to something really compelling and life enhancing and spiritually enriching. And then that encouraged them to make the next steps. And we were able to provide them with a framework in which they could learn how to do that. And they did find encouragement to make those steps. Right, we are honored to have Binyamin Cohen, our Vice President of Education, here with us to be interviewed. Welcome.
Thank you.
Can you tell us, please, how did you come to Lakeview? How did you find out about the shul? What brought you here? What do you love about being part of this community?
So I graduated a few years ago from the Pardes Educators Program, and part of the commitment of that program is to work in North American Jewish day schools for at least 3 years, which I wanted to anyway, so that was great. But in part of my search for the day school I wanted to work at, I landed in one that's in Chicago that I love. And when I told people I was moving to Chicago, they were like, "Oh, you're going to go live in Lakeview, right?" Several different people told me that independently of each other, not having time to communicate with each other or anything like that. So I was like, I guess I am going to go live in Lakeview. It also helped that two of my very good friends lived here, and they helped convince me also to live, want to move to Chicago and live in Lakeview, and paved the way for me to join this community in this shul and to be involved here. And they sold it to me. I mean, it was an easy sell, I think, to say this is a very welcoming and warm and diverse community, and also one that really, I think, is where I am Jewishly in meaningful ways that made me feel like this is the place, that kind of place I want to be.
So, Benny, I find myself talking about you a lot because I know, right? Because I go to all of these meetings with other community organizations in Chicago that do work with young professionals. And they're always like, how do we empower them? And I'm always like, what if you put them on the executive committee? Yeah. So do you want to talk about what it means to be a young professional in our shul who is in such a position of power within the synagogue?
Yeah, sure. First of all, it's a little intimidating, I have to say. But it's also very, I think it really speaks to what this community is all about, that anyone who wants to be involved, if they like make some effort to be involved, can do that. And I think for me it was finding something that I'm passionate about, which was easy because it's also my job to, be educating Jews. And so like to be also like educating Jews on the side is not so hard. And wanting to be involved in that. And so to be able to give something to this community that I care about and to be able to grow it in meaningful ways and be involved in it in a meaningful way, was an easy choice to like be in the education committee in general. And then I guess I sort of inherited it from my friend who was the previous vice president. But I also think that it's definitely something that's important for it to be. I mean, I don't want to necessarily like toot my own horn here too much, but I think it's a role that I think it's important for someone who's a committed and dedicated educator to be in, both in two directions. The first direction, sort of like working with the educational staff of the shul and the program staff to know like, from an educator's point of view, what's going to be useful, effective, interesting, and those kind of things. Be able to bring that lens to it as an educator, and also be able to go like the other direction to like the community and be like, look, talk to my friends and people I'm talk to at Kiddush. Be like, what are you interested in educationally? Do I as an educator have some perspective on that? I can like actually then talk to you about, and then can I then bring that to the committee and then the professional staff of the shul to be like, here's what we want to do educationally, and think here's like the things we're thinking about educationally. Here's the things that the community wants, and here like go for taking the other direction too, like going from the professional staff and saying here are the things that we would like. What should we tell the community that we want to try and do, and how can we get them involved in those kind of things as well?
So speaking of community involvement, do you want to say a word about the education committee and like kind of specifics of what you guys do?
Sure. So I think something I think is unique about the education committee that the professional staff, being you folks, are much more involved in a lot of the like active doing of and planning of a lot of the things than some of the other committees. Like you're not going to ever fix the roof, but you are going to teach the class. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could fix the roof if you want to.
He puts the schach on the sukkah.
That counts. Okay, right? Yeah. But I think in that respect, it allows. I mean, I know in the committee meetings we've had, it allows us for like a freer kind of like discussion that we can be like, we know what our resources are in a certain respect all the time, and we have those to work with, and we can be like, okay, what do we want the rabbi and the Rabbanit to do? Like, what are the classes we want them to teach? What do we want to get them to like, what do we want to get them to do? And it allows us to have very sort of like creative and wild ideas sometimes that we can then like rein into like more sane things. But it means that the starting point can be more creative and fun and like out of the box sometimes than otherwise. I think a lot of the things we do practically sort of like in the past and now are like thinking about the scholars and residents who we bring in, thinking about topics for the Beit Midrash Wednesday sessions. I think some of the things we want to do in the future are expand sort of like the educational offerings of the shul to more in more diverse ways. Like we've had some ideas of like I know there's something that happened in the past where people would call in every evening for like a 5-minute, vort, something like that. Have like a little conference call. We had an idea of having Torah on the go. One was like bike the Eruv, which would be fun. Like, bike around for 15 minutes, stop at some point. Like, here's this part of the Eruv. What does it do? I mean, I don't know what any of these things are. Like, how do they all work? And it would be like, and there's all kinds of things we could do like that. We're just like, looking at like bike to the Botanic Gardens and see like, not the Botanic Gardens, the Nature Museum. You're like, this animal is kosher, this animal is not. Or like the same thing in the zoo. Like, yeah, exactly. That'd be fun things like
kosher
that.
Animal. I guess they have giraffes. I don't know.
They probably have
get
some.
Very suspicious at the zoo when you start wandering around.
With a group being like,
talking about shchita.
Right. Yeah. Just like stand far away from the enclosure while you're doing it.
You should do like a Parshat Noach zoo trip.
Yeah, it'd be fun. Yeah, and I think those are the kinds of things that we can like contemplate doing because we have sort of this like freedom of creativity because we have such amazing resources to work with already at the shul in terms of like the like quote unquote normal educational offerings that we can be like, let's do something silly and crazy and fun and see what people like about it and think about those kind of things.
I have just two quick responses. One is I think you just guaranteed that we will have to air this podcast before Parshat Noach, timely.
All right,
which is an easy thing to guarantee, but for sure. And two, I just want to reflect back. I think as an educator here, when there's a strong education committee, I just feel much more like energized and just empowered, and just like it's a real force magnifier for the team that we have on professional staff to like use our training and our love of teaching in the way that's most efficient and most effective and most appreciated by the community. So it's really
there's
great.
a Gemara in Avodah Zarah that says that people learn what their hearts desire the most, and then what's useful also about, in addition to kind of general buy-in, it's useful for us to know like what do people's hearts desire, what are people hungry for in our soul that we can then feed and nourish, because all hunger for Torah is a beautiful kind of hunger. But sometimes it's hard to kind of keep your hand on what exactly where that hunger is.
I think it's also amazing that in this congregation there are absolutely phenomenal educators who care very much about education, and also like lay people who care very much about education. And it's not just that,
my favorite thing, we had a scholar in residence recently, and the scholar, because it's like the summer months, scholar in residence spoke very late at night, and someone showed up for the oneg who had never seen show up to an oneg before, and he was like, it's amazing, my kids are asleep, so it's perfect that it started at 9:30, and I was like, wow, that's really something to think about.
So if somebody doesn't know you, wants to be, where can you be found on, let's say, a Shabbat morning?
I can frequently found at Ashkama on a Shabbat morning, and then thereafter in the Beit Midrash reading something probably. Or if I don't go to Ashkama, in the middle of the right before where the shul starts, the slant. That's where I like to sit.
Slant, okay.
Yeah, like not the seat on the row on the slant is the worst, because then you're like you're close to the seat row in front of you, and you're falling over the entire time. So like right behind that is my favorite.
And does your name get called almost every time you're in?
Yes, very frequently. I think yeah, definitely.
Maybe explain.
Oh, because I'm a Cohen, and I have to bear the quote unquote bear the burden of being a Cohen, and the glorious burden. Almost,
one of the most interesting Cohen Levi ratios of any king I've ever been in. We had an enormous really, most communities far more Cohenim than Leviim. Here we have like 4 or 5 Leviim for every Cohen.
It's crazy.
It's really inexplicable.
It was very clean hands.
There's a lot of competition for washing the hands on Chagim. This for sure. Yeah. It's also funny how many more Kohanim show up on Chagim too. It's like, I think it's always like the nature of it, but it's just like
Let me tell you, when they don't show up, we don't.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, don't I know it?
Yes. All right, thank you so much for joining us on the Straw Hat.
Thank you, my pleasure.
We have selected a winner for the trivia question that we asked last week. Here goes.
Joseph Goodman here. Anshe Shalom opened up a Melrose Presence in 1940, but the current building was not erected until 1959.
This episode's Anshe Shalom trivia question is as follows. Send us in a voice note, and we will put it into the next episode. Send it to me at rabbanit@asbi.org or to Haley shul@asbi.org. So here's the question. Name all of the youth groups that happen on Shabbat morning, pronounce the names correctly, and tell me what all of the names mean. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Straw Hat. As always, we are deeply grateful to Haley Leventhal for producing this episode. If you have positive feedback, we'd love to take that in person, or you can send us voice notes, or you can send us letters or emails. Negative feedback, you can throw it into the ground and hope that it is swallowed up into the earth the way that Korach was. That's what you should do with negative feedback this week. Thank you so much for listening.